All righty, I'll go ahead and get it started off here. Some more people start joining here, but this is the Council to Advance Hunting and Shooting Sports monthly webinar, and I'm Marty Hogan. I work with the Council on their nationalr3plan.com, a collective place for like-minded people in the industry to get together and share ideas. And we're doing these webinars to kind of bring different topics to your attention and highlight certain areas. So today's webinar is called A Business Perspective of State Fish and Wildlife Agencies, and our guest today is Dr. Judd Michael, a business professor at Pennsylvania State University. And it's going to be a great presentation, but a couple things before we get started. You can go ahead and ask any questions that you want in the bottom right-hand chat box. Ask questions. We're going to come back to them after the presentation's done for, after the first 35 or so minutes, and then we'll finish up with any questions that you guys might have. So ask those questions. If we have any technical difficulties, please bear with us. We've been having some good luck lately, so hopefully we won't have any of that. This will be recorded and posted to YouTube later on in the week, so if you have to jet out or something, don't worry, it'll be there for you to review. Cyrus might have to take over for me. We're at the Iowa Iowa R3 Summit today, so we might have to go back into some meetings. So Cyrus might be moderating the question and answer session afterwards. But without further ado, Dr. Judd Michael, please take it away.
Okay, thanks. Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, depending on where you're at. Let me say that I'm with Penn State, of course. My home department here is Ecosystem Science and Management. Sam asked me to tell just a little bit about me. Ecosystem Science and Management is the home of forestry, fisheries, wildlife, water, general natural resources here at Penn State. My background is mostly business from undergrad and a master's perspective, and then a PhD in natural resources. My dad was a wildlife biologist, so I grew up doing field work and working on endangered species and environmental impact statements and things like that, and he always told me, well, there's no money in wildlife, so don't go that route. So I went a different way, but it's interesting here that I've come back around full circle a little bit. But this plays to my interests because it ties in my business background with natural resources and with agency work to try to help you all to be better as you try to achieve your goals. Speaking of goals, here's the two big ones for today. First, to show the importance of thinking like a business for an agency, and then second, give an overview of the business planning process project that we recently completed phase 1 for Pennsylvania Fish and Boat Commission. If we think about why natural resource agencies have financial challenges, I think it can help us to do a better job of managing the agencies and not to operate in the red. There is value to thinking like a business that we've tried to work with our own state agencies on. And then as we get into it, we'll talk more about the case study and let you see what we've done here in the last 18 months or so. Most of you may know charts like this. For example, national fishing participation has declined slowly over time. It's been fairly steady the last few years in terms of participants, but versus historical levels, we're down a good bit over the past. So for example, these numbers show that the net angler loss has been quite significant in just 1 year at a time. If we have millions of anglers leaving fishing, that doesn't bode well for the future. And one of the purposes for programs like R3 and then what we do is to try to understand how we might change these trends and ways to mitigate the losses. As we did the project for Pennsylvania Fish and Boat, we came up with graphics like this, for example. Lots of demographic changes in Pennsylvania, much like in other states. Competition for leisure time and the way people think about leisure and how they consume leisure time has changed, and that ties in with how recreation itself is transitioning. You put that all together and it clearly results in less fishing, and you see similar numbers for hunting. If we just look at resident days of fishing in Pennsylvania, you can see not only do the number of thousands of days drop the last couple decades, but it's almost like a double jeopardy where we have days per angler dropping roughly in half as well. As I said, the hunting numbers look similar. If you look at the percentage of population that hunts, that's been going down. The peak in total hunters was back around the late 70s, early 80s, and that's slowly declined as well. When we looked at Pennsylvania Fish and Boat Commission issues that they had from a physical side, this graphic shows a picture that's not very pretty. Total revenues and expenses, if you look at the green line, that's revenues. You can see those have been declining, while at the same time expenditures have been roughly flat, some years a little bit higher. One of the big scary parts just in the last year or two is this new $8 million pension liability that the state has put onto the agency. If you look at what happens to the lines there, it shows that there's a big problem where all of a sudden we go from being mostly break even to very much being in the hole. Unfortunately, lots of you in the states are in the same kind of boat where you can see the green line representing your revenues is going down and the red line representing your expenses is either flat or going up. And when those intersect is when you have a problem and all of a sudden you are operating in the red, and most state agencies can't continue to operate that way. So I guess a basic question for everybody is, how does a for-profit company stay in business? The basic answer is revenues have to be greater than expenses. There are different ways that companies can do that, but the basic options for a business are we try to increase revenues and or we try to decrease costs. If you don't do one of those, and in many cases you have to do both, then you're, as a corporation, you're going to go bankrupt. So we might ask the same question in terms of state level or natural resource agencies, and how do you, quote unquote, stay in business? Once again, I think you can ask yourself those questions, and the answer has to be revenues should be greater than expenses. Now, for some of you, you get to have state level donations, if you will, or subsidies, however you want to call those, into your coffers. Pennsylvania, we don't get to do that. It has to be solely self-supporting. So if you're a company, and I think we can think about this as well from an agency perspective, the bosses would ask themselves, how do we increase revenues? Here are some main examples, such as entering new markets with existing products or services, create new products or services, add some kinds of fees or charges to the customers, raise our prices. The adding fees and charges example would be from airlines, how they nickel and dime us to death now with extra fees for the peanuts, the drinks, certainly for baggage and the best seats. For example, the aisle seats are more expensive than the center row. And then finally, increasing demand, which can come from new customers or current customers trying to get them to consume more of our products. The big question here that everybody should be thinking about is, what's the focus? I would say that the focus in general is on marketing and the customer or the consumer of our products and services, and how do we focus our agencies in on increasing revenues by new products or existing products and services and making those better for the consumer. Maybe you've seen one of these old posters before about apathy. If we don't take care of the customer, maybe they'll stop bugging us. Lots of state agencies, of course nobody on this call, but lots of agencies we may deal with seem to have an apathetic attitude towards the customer, and there's really no good customer service or not good customer relations. We can pick on the Department of Transportation because they're not on this call and say they're maybe one of the worst about most apathy towards us as customers. Most of us would like to try to increase participation. A corporation would say, if you want to do that, you sure as heck better understand the customer and what they want, why they buy their product, what's in it for them, so to speak. So we're going to try our first poll here. This is a Porsche Cayman, let's say $54,000, $55,000. So your task now is to type in the little box, what is the competition for this car? So if everybody can take a couple seconds and start typing in their answers, we'll look at the results as they come up. Okay, we have a couple BMWs, Corvette, that's a good one. 4 trucks, all right. Tesla, Prius C. A little price difference between the Prius C, College. Okay, so there's some smart people on this call, I can tell. Porsche marketers know that the answer to this question is not just a Corvette or a BMW M3 or a convertible or something else. They know that, for example, it could be a bass boat. They know that the person who buys this car doesn't buy it for their primary transportation. The car is bought as a toy, so to speak. It's disposable income, and Porsche has to market against bass boats, lots of jewelry for the spouse. It could be round the world vacation or another very expensive vacation. And if I recall, the demographics of the buyer of this car is roughly 90-some% male, and so the wife of the buyer of this car might say, honey, you could have bought me some really nice things instead of this toy for yourself. So the takeaway from this is that agencies need to understand their customers and what the alternative is for hunting, fishing, boating, and what those people can do with their leisure time and what they can do with their money. So the smart marketers in corporations are really good about understanding their customer, and I think that's one of the places where agencies might be a little bit weak. And the person that wrote college cost there is exactly right too. Instead of buying the sports car for the midlife crisis, you can buy, well, let's see, that buys you about 1 year of tuition at Penn State these days for out-of-state students. We don't want to think just about raising revenues. We also want to think about options to decrease costs. Could be inefficiency, could be production costs, certainly personnel costs are on the table, and then operating expenses. I think every agency should consider both revenues and expenses and ways to be more efficient and more productive with their money. So this brings us to the real agency dilemma. How do you increase revenues? How do you decrease costs? This brought us to the table with the Pennsylvania Fish and Boat Commission when Director Arway came to us here at Penn State and said, we need somebody to view us like a business, an outsider that could come in and prepare a business plan that would feed into their next strategic plan. Director Arway and his staff saw that they had some problems. They realized that the lines were going to cross, and if they didn't do something, they were going to be running in the red, which is something that John doesn't want to do, and by policy, he's not supposed to do. Here's an overview of the agency as we started to look at it from the outside in, and this includes myself plus Ryan Loudermilk, who you saw at the cover page. He's an MBA student who did most of the work. At different times, we had 3 other MBA students working on the project to try to understand different parts of the agency. It was pretty clear that trends were generally against the agency. One of the facts of life that a lot of people didn't want to understand or they were in denial about were that programmatic cuts are a reality. That includes cutbacks on the number of fish and number of hatcheries and things like that. Unfortunately, most of the low-hanging expense fruit had already been harvested. The agency had done a pretty good job of going through its system and reducing expenses that were easy to cut back on. There were a few other problem areas that we saw, such as the mandated and fixed expenses, mostly surrounding personnel. For example, you all may be in the same boats where you've got mandated health care, mandated retirement that you can't do anything about, but those costs are adding up quickly and being an even bigger constraint on your ability to go about your business. And then finally, there were external forces such as politics in Pennsylvania that were reducing the director's ability to try to cut back even bigger. And those, for example, were issues such as cutting back on a whole hatchery. So one of the major takeaways we got in the first 6 months of this project was change, quote unquote, was definitely needed at the agency, but it's very, very difficult. And that took us a little bit farther down the path on some things we needed to try to work on. The first one I want to talk about is how to decrease costs. I won't go into that too much here, but it was clear to us that fish production was more than necessary. So for example, in Pennsylvania, we've seen reductions in the number of anglers and other small things such as increases in catch and release. So we put those trends together and it became clear that they couldn't justify the 30-some million fish that they were raising every year. And then if you work that backwards, it became apparent that they didn't need all the hatcheries that they currently operated, especially if we moved forward and we're going to cut back several million fish each year. Now, here's a little update on the current status. Roughly 6 weeks or so ago, the Board of Commissioners for Pennsylvania Fish and Boat approved giving Director Arway power to cut costs. This included hatcheries plus fish production to the tune of around $2 million. Nothing had been cut yet. The agency just said we have proposed for next July 1st that we will make cutbacks if, and this is a big if, the fee increase that was on the table before the legislators was not approved or is not approved. Well, this causes lots of heartburn with our politicians. They've asked for John's resignation. They've said that Penn State did a terrible job with our business plan. They've even tied it to such strange things as the drug opioid epidemic. And so how you get from cutbacks in your state agency to the opioid epidemic is beyond me, but I guess that's the kind of thing you deal with at the state level these days. So on to the bigger area that we focused more on was increasing revenues. So here's an example of a table that the students created showing on your left here the last 3 increases for fishing licenses, 83, 96, and 2005, the last one, with the percentage increase in each. Here's the estimated sales lost in fishing licenses, as well as percent anglers that were lost. But the good news in all that is, even though we lost anglers, the net revenue change was always positive. So for example, even though we increased prices by almost 30% here most recently, the license revenue increase was quite significant. Now what we had the students do was do a sensitivity type analysis that I think any agency should consider before you raise your rates. We took the various price increases from 10% on up to what the max was in terms of, net revenue at 132% price increase from $21 to $49 almost. We estimated this would result in a 34% decrease in participation, but that's where the net maximum revenue increase was to be found. Now, of course, almost nobody knows from past experience what would happen in reality if you raised your fees from $21 to almost $50. So this was totally new ground, and we can estimate this based on some good statistics, but in reality it's hard to guesstimate what would happen. But otherwise, this was a good exercise for the agency leadership, and you could do the same thing to try to determine what your outcome is going to be based on a given price increase. We asked the agency to think about new and revised licensing options. For example, the muskie breeding program in Pennsylvania is $1 million plus program. Very few anglers fish for muskies. So we gave them options such as, should you shut down that program completely? Could you create a muskie stamp, much like we have a trout stamp in Pennsylvania, where it's a user pay model to try to cover the costs of this unique niche program? A few other options might be wild trout stamps, which we don't have now, a senior lifetime trout permit, which would be new, or something like roll the trout permit into the regular license so nobody has to buy a trout stamp. You get the right to fish for trout that are stocked by the state if you buy a regular license. Now, some relatively small percentage of people, let's say 30% of anglers, don't fish for stocked trout, so those are the people that would end up paying more if this kind of thing would be put into place. A few other things, in our year of analysis and investigation, we noticed lots of people that are fishing and boating without a license. Here around State College, we have a number of state lakes, and one of the things we noticed is that a lot of Asian students from Penn State University go out and fish, but as we talked to them, they didn't have a license and they didn't know that they needed a license. So there's a lot of education that could be done to increase revenue from those folks that are cheating, if you will, or maybe it's just lack of knowledge on their part. We also see lots of unpowered boaters that don't have a launch permit that are using our waterways but don't pay any fee for it. And we estimated there would be several $1 million of monies that are left on the table that aren't being captured at this time. A few other out-of-the-box things included a consumptive water use fee. As you may know, Pennsylvania has a big natural gas industry. The fracking part of that requires a lot of use of water, but at this time, a lot of groups that use our water resources don't pay an adequate fee or don't pay any fee for that. Another thing that could be considered is mandatory unpowered boat licenses. The position that we came from and that the agency comes from is that Pennsylvania Fish and Boat provides water safety, rescue, and other things to everybody. And if you launch your boat into a river that's not controlled by the state, or from a launch area that's not controlled by the state, then you don't have to pay a fee. We suggested changing this in part because of the rapid increase in popularity of kayaks, paddle boards, and things like that, where once again we think there are millions of dollars of revenue left uncollected, even though the folks that are boating out there enjoy the safety and the services provided by Fish and Boat Commission. A few other out-of-the-box things were reimbursement for services provided to these other government bodies. So for example, Pennsylvania Conservation and Natural Resources is the state parks and Bureau of Forestry folks. Fish and Boat Commission says we provide lots of things to that agency, but we're never reimbursed for it. Same thing with Pennsylvania Emergency Management Association, Pennsylvania National Guard, and our townships, which is the local government system, receive lots of benefits from the state agency, and yet they don't at all or rarely pay for those. So there are lots of ways that you could think of in terms of out-of-the-box services that are provided that you don't get reimbursed for that maybe you deserve to be reimbursed for. Of course, a big area that all of us are thinking about these days is how to improve the marketing focus and capabilities within our agencies. So here's an example of a map that the students put up or developed, and then I've got to put up for you. If you know Pennsylvania, you know off to the left here is the Pittsburgh metropolitan area, lots of people, dense population, and then over to the east, you've got Philadelphia butting up against New Jersey, very highly populated. The way Pennsylvania is growing is that this whole southeastern tier is getting much more populated. And then you see in the middle of the green here is State College and central Pennsylvania with the university. So the red is very few anglers per area. The green, where you might suspect up in rural Pennsylvania, lots more density of anglers. So if you take that kind of map and consider it with this, it becomes much more valuable to you. So if we do anticipated population growth from this year over the next 5, darker green is greater population growth. As you can see in the rural areas of northern Pennsylvania, little or no growth, and in fact we may have net population loss. Compare that to the metropolitan areas, and obviously they're going to grow faster. And then we tie in other data points such as counts of customer ID. So for example, how many people have fishing licenses by zip code? This is the kind of data that can help your marketers to target their marketing better, to make your marketing efforts more efficient, more effective, and cost efficient, if you will. How about women and youth? Another area that we're all concerned about in Pennsylvania, if we have roughly 50% of the population, but only 18% of the license holders are women, then that suggests that there is lots of opportunity. The churn rate for women we know is higher. Pennsylvania has a few other issues with non-English speaking or immigrant populations, and how do we reach those? The new female R3 work group is one area that we're working on to try to address those issues, and we're very hopeful that that will make a difference going forward. We looked at the imaging and the messaging from a marketing perspective of Fish and Boat Commission, and we've seen pictures like this from around the country. If you think about it, this is the way we're promoting the fun of fishing. What's the message here? Pennsylvania is full of big fish like these folks, and that catching the big fish is the key to fun. If that's the message that we're producing and we're promoting in our marketing, then it becomes a bit of a conflict with what the data shows. For example, surveys have said that more than 35% of the people go fishing for sport or recreation or fun. And a big part of the sport of fishing is to be with family and friends. So look at this National Fishing and Boating Week, which shows a fairly large fish, but in reality maybe the average mom or dad, let's say, wants to take their 10-year-old out and they want to have fun. They don't really care if they catch a giant fish. They just want to go have good family time. So we would come back to these messages that showed the very large fish with the middle-aged white male catching them, and try to think about how to change the messaging over to something more like this. If you're a corporation, you really worry about your brand, and we think one of the areas that state agencies could work on is how do they build their brand. A popular way to look at this from the business world is a diagram like this. If you look on the left side axis, you see contributions to conservation, low and high, and then contributions to recreation. We would put Department of Environmental Protection here in Pennsylvania in this quadrant. Good for conservation, not much for recreation. The folks at DCNR with the state parks, they're good with recreation and just middle of the road with conservation. Unfortunately, Pennsylvania Game Commission and Fish and Boat Commission would be down here, where they're not very well known for conservation. Our point to the leadership was you need to think about how to migrate your brand up here into the quadrant 2 so that you're known for your contributions to recreation, but also you get credit for all the great things you do from a conservation standpoint. So Fish and Boat right now does an awful lot on conservation, but very, very few people know about that or recognize it. So from a stakeholder standpoint, you might be much better off with your politicians and policymakers and other stakeholders if you could migrate your brand for your agency up to a point where you're viewed as providing lots of benefits to the citizens of your state. A big problem we saw is how to engage retailers. We saw multiple places where the agency was shooting itself in the foot, so to speak, by the way that they work with retailers. If you think about it, the retailers are the face of your product many times. If you have the large percentage of your licenses are sold through a retailer, then that becomes a very key part of the supply chain. So we ran some numbers here and showed that in red, there are lots of places where a license is sold by an agent and the agent actually loses money. So what do you think the incentive is or the motivation is by those retailers if every time they sell one of your licenses, they lose money? And in some cases, it's fairly significant money. Part of this comes from the transaction fees for credit cards, and if 90% of all these transactions are using credit cards or debit cards that incur a fee, then that's where a lot of the loss comes from. So one of the takeaways is agencies should consider how to incentivize retailers to do a better job of pushing their products. So a few summary thoughts based on what we did with Pennsylvania Fish and Boat Commission. If you read the literature on goal setting for corporations, you start to learn that viewing an agency or any other nonprofit like a business would help you to meet your financial goals. And then I've got underlined here a customer mindset. We think that's very important, obviously, for any for-profit business, but in today's world, it's becoming much more important for agencies like yours. One of the challenges we see is how do we make almost everybody within the agency, from biologists to law enforcement, to get a customer service or a marketing mindset. We think as we move forward, people like the wildlife conservation officers or WCOs here in Pennsylvania have a key role to play in educating people that they see, maybe selling a license to them if they're unlicensed, maybe helping them to understand how to consume the product and be a good salesperson for the brand. Unfortunately, lots of folks in your agency that came up through biology or ecosystems or something else think of marketing just like this picture. If I say marketing when I teach my classes to the wildlife and fishery students and they talk about what does that mean to me, it's this kind of thing, a used car salesman. So we know that there's lots of pushback from people in your agency that ought to be doing a better job with customer service and a customer mindset. So here's a number that reflects revenues for a business. It just happens to be Pennsylvania Fish and Boat Commission annual revenues. If you're running a for-profit business that has $53 million in sales, how much as a percentage do you think that business would allocate to marketing, advertising, and so forth? Well, when we've asked this before, there's a good answer, 10%. Yeah, if anybody else wants to type that in, they can put their numbers. 10%, Alan, is actually a really good estimate that a for-profit business would spend. Unfortunately, if we look at numbers at Fish and Boat in Pennsylvania and maybe your agencies, I suspect that it's down closer to 1% or maybe 2%. That, I think, reflects a problem in that we don't spend enough money on marketing ourselves as the agency, all the good things that we do, and marketing the products and services that we have to sell to our customers. Here's another point that we've seen, and I think others in the world of agency management have seen as well. You all are really good at data. You've got data-driven aspects related to habitat, species, GIS, biology, so forth. Unfortunately, I don't think you're very good at customer data and marketing data and trying to manage that kind of system or understand it, if you will, to help understand the customer and get them to buy your licenses, for example. A lot of the systems that we've seen don't work very well together. It's hard to compare customer data. So, for example, in Pennsylvania, we don't have an easy way to cross-market people who have a boat license and a fish license, which seems pretty obvious to us from the outside that you could do that, but it's not easy to do at this point. You're probably also not very capable or not very good at digging into the trends to understand how those things are affecting your business and the products and services you sell. Finally, I think that most agencies are understaffed. You probably don't have enough people in the agency that are really good at business, either from the revenue side or the cost reduction side. So to start to wrap up here, I guess the big questions for you all to think about as you leave today are how to think more like a business. What are the ways for you to increase revenues? What are the ways for you to decrease costs? Hopefully this little time we'll spend today will help you to think about those things and give you some more ideas. We should have done a poll here, Sam. Anybody know what this stands for? Is it the name for a female pig? Thank you, Samantha. No, that stands for same old way. Oh, the statement of work, sorry. So it's the same old way. And the semi-humorous way to think about this is if you keep doing things the same old way, what are you going to get? The same old thing. So I encourage all of you out there and everybody in the agency world to think about how to make the changes that are necessary. Certainly if you've seen your lines start to cross with revenues and expenses so that you're either in the red now or you're going to be in the red in the near term, then you need to figure out how to make a change. From the outside, we'd like to see agencies operate more like a business. I suspect most or all of you have more pressures every year on costs and revenues, whether that's from the personnel side or fish food or fuels or something else. The other thing that comes next after a business plan would be a strategic plan. We'd like to advise all of you to have a strategic plan that doesn't just sit on a shelf collecting dust. It needs to be something that you'll use and revisit every 3 to 5 years. And then finally, even the law enforcement folks, even the biologists, everybody should think more like a marketer. I know our kids here on campus that are coming through the wildlife biology track are really smart, and once we start to think about their contributions, I think they have a lot to add, and I suspect in your groups they could do the same kind of thing to figure out where's the customer focus, what should we be doing, and what do today's youth, for example, like to see. So that's what I have here for my 35 minutes or so. I guess we can take a few questions on the chat or whatever works best.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much, Judd. So first question is from Nicole. She was referring back to that quadrant you had with the different organizations on there. She was wondering how you placed those on the chart. What were the criteria you guys used? I'll flip back to it for you guys.
Thanks. So the short answer is the MBA students are taught this kind of thing in their classes. It's qualitative. There's not a quantitative method that we use to do this kind of characterization. So we took some of the key agencies in the state of Pennsylvania and then talked to a number of stakeholders and used our own expertise to think about what the agencies were doing, where were they contributing, and then ideally where we'd like to have our client, which was Fish and Boat Commission, be in order for it to help achieve its goals. So there's a longer answer to that students in the business school spend a lot of time on. This is done with brands a lot. So for example, Crest toothpaste realizes that it's in a quadrant it doesn't want to be versus Colgate, and then the marketing people work really hard to change the advertising message or their cost structure or something else to try to move that brand image with the customer up to a more preferred area. So I'm sorry, I don't have a real numerical answer to give you, but it's something that we thought was valuable for the agency, if nothing else for the visual learners who might not understand it if we just talked them through it in words, but once they see it this way, it's much easier for them to go, aha, I understand what you want us to do.
Great. Sam asked, a lot of states are beginning to start to get access to their customer data more and more, and being able to see more and more about their customers. So How do we use this information to help kind of formulate and inform our business and R3 strategies going forward?
Not knowing the data, it's hard for me to give you specific suggestions, but let's assume that you have demographic data, you have their emails, of course, contact information, their historical purchase patterns. If you're like Pennsylvania, you could cross-dock the data from all their purchases. Ideally, you start to look for trends. A good way is to say, we're going to do an ad campaign and we're going to look for changes in purchase behavior. So that would be a smart thing to do. Unfortunately, lots of us do something with respect to marketing. We put out a new campaign. We, for example, join with Penn State Athletics and we sponsor the football team. But we don't do a good job of following up and looking at the data on purchases after that, so we don't know the return on investment for those expenditures. And we are doing a shotgun approach, sort of shooting in the dark, and we're not sure what we get out of our investments.
Right.
Sam, otherwise I would say in general, learn as much as you can about the customer to know what they want. And some of this could be done with focus groups. Some of this could be done with surveys asking them about what they want to see from you. And let me add one more thing. If all you do is get data from the customers who already buy a license, then you're missing out on the most important, most valuable data, and I think that's from the people who don't buy. So that's a key component for everybody to think about, is how do we tap into the folks that aren't our customers?
Yeah. All right.
Want me to jump down to Alan's question there?
Yeah, you can go ahead and take it away if you want.
Good. Okay, so Alan asks, has a commission determined what their customers value and what they're currently delivering to assess those gaps? I think the basic answer is no, we don't truly know what the customers value. We don't truly know what we could be delivering to assess the gaps, although a lot of people in the agency and a lot of people in the know would say people want to go and catch fish. Well, what's the optimal number of catches per hour? What's a size that meets their requirements for their investment in time to go out on the water? I don't think we know very well what makes it for that customer who goes out to fish. I think from a boating perspective, for example, we know people like to go out and have a good time. If you're a kayaker, you have a better time if there aren't jet skis and power boats buzzing around scaring you. So a lot of people want to go out and consume nature in a quiet, safe way. I think we understand that in terms of the value they seek. Sometimes it's hard to give them that, although we could come up with lakes, for example, that are unpowered boats or have a horsepower maximum. From a hunting perspective, for what I've seen from our pheasant program, for example, is if people go pheasant hunting, they want to harvest a pheasant. I think that's what they value. And then they also have secondary values in terms of, I went out and taught my son how to hunt. I took my dog out, and that was enjoyable to me. So there are a lot of those soft answers to that question that are really hard to get at in terms of pure data. That comes back to Sam's question is, it's hard to look at numbers sometimes and really understand what does a customer get out of an experience like recreation from hunting and fishing. So Alan, the long answer is I don't think that we're there yet in terms of really knowing the customer from top to bottom, and then how to keep them satisfied. All right, so Ian says, tell me more about how sensitivity license prices rises can be estimated. Yes, so the politicians get terrified, and that's one of the follow-ups here in Pennsylvania, is that our politicians immediately balk when the agency wants to raise prices. even though I think we have a really good case to be made for the need to raise fees and the fact that we haven't raised fees in about a dozen years, and that the value of the products and services we provide are worth more than what we charge the customer. Let's see, to do a true price sensitivity analysis like a corporation would do, you need a lot more data. And this brings us back again to the lack of solid data, what some people might call big data, from our customers. So our students, I think, could have done this type of analysis if the agency or somebody else had the data. But unfortunately, there are factors like we don't change prices enough. It's hard to put this into a laboratory setting where we could do a simulated price increase. So once again, we don't know in terms of true price sensitivity what happens. We can look at historical changes, which are few and far between in this state, and then do some estimates. But it's with the proverbial grain of salt as that we do those estimates. And I agree, this kind of metric is really valuable, but at this point, I don't have a good answer for how to describe the price sensitivity for any given amount for our fishing or hunting licenses. So let's see, did Doug respond here? Good question. Although revenue's up, we did get a short-term gain of committed customers and lost a younger long-term customer. Yeah, so lots of things to consider. And of course, one of the challenges is here, should we, as agencies, try to increase the number of hunters and anglers just by the nature of what we do? Or is it okay for us to raise prices knowing that we're going to reduce the number of participants in our sports? A lot of people have a hard time doing something that they know is going to lead to fewer and fewer anglers and angler days out there, even though we know we need the money. So there's maybe a philosophical question for everybody to answer. Let's see.
Yeah, so
go ahead.
Yeah, Dan kind of has a long comment here, but I think what he's getting at is there's only a certain amount of resource that can be shared among Americans and hunting and whatnot, and some of those resources are being squeezed as they sell off public lands, and access becomes harder to come by nowadays. So I guess is there a point where the resource gets exhausted by having too many people join?
Well, I guess as a hunter in the first week of deer season, I think there are lots of times and places where there are too many people hunting, and that's become a real problem for this state, for example, as the number of open lands decreases, either from sprawl or from people closing off their private lands, then it gets more crowded and less safe and less enjoyable for people. So some people would say, yeah, that's part of the problem. When we have opening day of trout season and all the trout streams are shoulder to shoulder with anglers, to me, that's not fun. Alan Kahn, well, Penn State beat Rutgers. Boy, who knows who this team is? I have to say yes, but we'll see who shows up. Hopefully they've learned their lesson now.
Yeah. And then just kind of wrapping up here, as questions kind of slow here, but can you recommend some resources for us to find and access to use to educate our colleagues on this topic, specifically kind of, treating the Fish and Wildlife agencies more as a business and looking at it through a business lens?
I guess you could read the document that we produce for Pennsylvania Fish and Boat Commission. It's publicly available on their website. It would show you an idea of the things that we tackled and the things that we considered. Other than that, that's a good question, Sam. I haven't done a lit review to try to come up with resources that would help the average agency person. I think the things that your agency does, all the R3 working groups, all the other stakeholders in this world that are trying their best at changing the current situation are doing a good job, and that's one place to start.
All right. Well, looks like we're kind of slowing down on questions here, so we'll just kind of wrap it up. Thank you very much, Dr. Judd Michael, for giving this presentation today. Hopefully it was very insightful for people to take a different perspective when looking at their, license structure, when they go into their R3 planning meetings and whatnot. So I think people will get a lot of use out of this. So thank you, everybody who has joined. We have a survey link in the chat box. If you don't mind just filling that out real quick, we want to provide Dr. Michael with some feedback on his presentation and us some feedback on how we can keep making these webinars worth it for you guys. But next month we'll have another webinar for you guys, so keep an eye out for that. And until next time, we will talk to you later. Thanks.
Thank you.